Hi friends, write in the comments what city you are from. Perhaps you also had similar stories. It is very interesting to know what happened in your corner of the world. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it, share your thoughts or stories in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. There are more exciting and unexpected stories ahead. All characters and events described in this story are fictitious. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Do not judge strictly. While I was pulling people out of the burning house, someone else was entering mine. All my life I considered myself strong. The army taught me to endure pain, to lose friends, to survive in hell. The fire service taught me not to panic when everything is falling apart. But nothing prepared me for the fact that it would not be the walls that would destroy me, but my heart. That it would not be the flaming beams that would strike, but the woman I considered mine. It all started with one phrase said between cereal and a cartoon. Mom's friend Ryan came by, Tommy said, not looking up from the screen. He always brings her coffee. I smiled. Then again. A week later, I turned on the camera and watched another man kiss my wife in my bed. My name is Jack Harper, and if you think you have a strong family, just look at what they do when you're not around. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, the kind that tears at your throat and stings your eyes until the world in front of you is a blur. I was crouched, pressing my gloved hand to the warped wood floor of an old ranch house on the outskirts of Pine Creek, Colorado. The flames roared like a living thing, growling and snapping, licking the walls and ceiling with hungry tongues. Somewhere trapped in the chaos was a family, 2 children, and their mother, according to the panicked call the fire department had received 20 minutes earlier. My crew was outside, dousing the fire with hoses, but I was inside, the heat pressing against my gear like a physical weight, testing every ounce of my experience and endurance. I'm Jack Harper, now a firefighter, once a Marine. The instincts drilled into me by the Corps never fade. Stay calm, assess the situation, act. The fire was loud, but I'd learned to listen through the noise, to catch the faintest screams or the creak of a collapsing beam. My mask fogged slightly as I crawled forward, holding the thermal imaging camera, the screen glowing with the heat of the fire. The living room was an oven, the furniture charred to black skeletons, but the stairs to the second floor were still standing. Barely. I moved quickly, my heavy boots pounding the floor, my heart beating steadily despite the chaos. "Mrs. Callahan," I called, my voice muffled by the mask, but breaking through the roar of the fire. "Leela, Ethan, where are you?" A faint whimper came from above. I ran up the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the creak of the wood beneath my feet. The heat was even greater up there, the air shimmering like a desert mirage. I followed the sound down the hall, past the bedroom already in flames, to the closed door at the end. The handle burned through my gloves, but I turned it and pushed the door open. There they were, huddled in the corner of the small bathroom, their mother clutching her 2 children to her, as if she could shield them from the flames with her body alone. Leela, about 8, stared wide-eyed, her face smeared with soot. Ethan, the younger, was coughing, his small body shaking. Their mother, Karen, looked up at me, fearful but with fierce determination. "Get down," I barked, dropping to my knees to be level with them. "I'll pull you up. Hold on to me." Karen nodded, loosening her grip just enough for me to scoop Ethan up into my arms. He was light, too light, and his coughing was heartbreaking. I handed him to his mother, who held him close, then held out my hand to Leela. "Let's go together," I said firmly but calmly. "Stay behind me." The hallway had become a fiery tunnel, flames curling up the walls as if chasing us. I led the way, Leela clutching the strap of my gear, Karen and Ethan following behind. The stairs were still standing, but the fire was creeping higher, devouring the railings. I checked the first step. It was strong enough. "Quick," I said, urging them down. A beam collapsed behind me, and Karen screamed. I didn't look back. You don't look back in a fire. You either keep going or you don't get out. We reached the first floor, the front door glowing in the smoke like a rectangle of salvation. My team was there, silhouetted against the flashing red lights of the fire truck. I pushed the family toward them, shouting, "Take them," and turned to make sure there was no one left in the house. Protocol. We are leaving no one. The boss grabbed me by the shoulder. "Harper, it's too hot. Let's move." I shook my head, looking around the room again. "I'm fine. Clean." He didn't argue. He knew me well enough. 30 seconds later, I was outside, the night air a slap in my face as I ripped off my mask. The Callahans were already in the ambulance, oxygen masks over their faces, blankets over their shoulders. Karen caught my eye and mouthed, "Thank you." I nodded, my throat too dry to respond. The fire was under control, my team putting out the last flames. I stood there, breathing hard, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins, just like those days in Fallujah. Another war, the same tide. I was 38, no longer a boy, but I was stronger than most, thanks to years of discipline and a body that hadn't yet failed me. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and began to remove my gear, its weight falling away like a second skin. The warmth of home was different. Our house sat on a quiet street in Pine Creek, a two-story craftsman that I had been building piece by piece over the last few years. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours, every nail, every board, every shingle laid by my hands or by the hands of friends who owed me money. The porch light was on as I pulled into the driveway, my old Ford pickup chugging to a halt. It was after midnight, the city was asleep, and the mountains lay dark and majestic under the stars. I opened the door carefully so it wouldn't creak. The living room was bathed in a soft lamplight that made everything seem safe. Sarah was curled up on the sofa with a book, her dark hair tucked behind her ear. She looked up as I entered, her smile quick but tired, as if she'd been waiting for me, even though I'd asked her not to linger. "You're late," she said, her voice light but with a subtle edge. "Fire on Aspen Road," I said, pulling off my boots and placing them by the door. "Family got out." She nodded, closing the book, but holding the page with her finger. "That's good, Jack. Are you okay?" "As always." I crossed the room and kissed her forehead, her skin cool beneath my lips. She smelled of lavender and coffee, as always, but there was something distant about the way she pressed herself against me, a little less than before. I pushed the thought away. I was tired, that's all. Fires played tricks on your mind, making you see things that aren't there. "Is Tommy asleep?" I asked, glancing up at the stairs. The floorboards upstairs were silent, like everything else in this house after 9 o'clock. "Like a dead man," she answered, stretching. Her voice was soft, a little tired. The sweater, too big for her fragile figure, slipped off her shoulder, revealing the delicate line of her collarbone. I involuntarily held my gaze not out of desire, but out of memory. At that moment, I suddenly saw her clearly, not today, but the one we met 10 years ago. Sarah was different then. Or maybe life was just different. We met at a party at a mutual friend's house. She came with a friend, not planning on staying long. I remember her laughing loudly, ringingly, her head tilted slightly, as if she were laughing with her whole body. She was wearing a simple gray dress and red sneakers, and in this mismatched outfit, she looked brighter than anyone else in the room. She was into photography, drank black coffee without sugar, and carried a notebook with her, in which she wrote down phrases she heard from random passers-by. We walked until dawn, argued about films, and ate ice cream in January. Everything seemed so real then, simple, easy. She was alive, a spark that lit up everything around her, including me. I loved listening to her talk about the world with that special curiosity that those who have not yet been disappointed have. Now she was just as beautiful. Just the same Sarah. The same eyes, only deeper. The same hands, only hidden a little more often in the sleeves. There was a silence in her. Not the kind that comes from tired people, but the kind that comes from the restrained, the unexpressed. As if she was carrying something inside that she was silent about, not because she didn't want to talk, but because she didn't know if anyone would hear her. I looked at her like a photograph in an old album, familiar, dear, but slightly faded, not because the feelings were gone, but because years had fallen between us. Worries, Tommy, work, all those days when there was no time for talking or touching or for us. Are you tired? I asked. She smiled, briefly, almost imperceptibly. A little, she answered, but I'm really tired. You know, the kind of tiredness you get when the day has really ended. I nodded, and I wanted to say how much I missed her, the one that was, and the one that is nearby. I wanted to say how much I miss us simple, stupid, laughing, but I didn't say it. He just sat down next to her and put his hand on her knee. She didn't put it away, and that, for that evening, was enough. I followed her into the kitchen, where she poured me a glass of water without asking. Are you hungry? She asked, opening the refrigerator. Nope, fine. I took the glass, our fingers touched. Shower and sleep. She nodded, glancing at the clock on the wall. Tomorrow is a long day. I have parent-teacher conferences. Tommy has football. I'll take him, I said. A good excuse to escape the paperwork at the unit. She smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. You're a good father, Jack. I wanted to ask what was wrong, why her voice sounded like it was coming from behind a glass wall, but I didn't. I wasn't a wordsmith, not like her. Sarah could talk to anyone, charm an entire room, make a child feel like the most important person in the world. And me. I was better at doing things, fixing, saving, building. Words always slipped through my fingers like sand. Instead, I squeezed her shoulder and went upstairs. Tommy's door was ajar, and I peered in. He was sprawled across the bed, one arm behind his head, his dinosaur pajamas twisted over his small frame. His chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of sleep, and I stood there, watching him. 6 years old, full of energy and questions all day, but now, in the silence, he seemed so small. I adjusted the blankets around him, brushing a strand of blonde hair off his forehead. Sleep tight, baby, I whispered so quietly I could barely hear it. He didn't move. In the morning, the house smelled of coffee and pancakes, Sarah's specialty. She stood at the stove, flipping them with that effortless grace that made everything she did seem effortless. Tommy sat at the table, furiously coloring on a sheet of paper, his tongue hanging out in his eagerness. Morning, champion, I said, ruffling his hair as I sat down next to him. Dad, he grinned, looking at me. I drew a fire truck. Look, I leaned over, examining the red scribbles and crooked wheels. Nice car, Tommy. Are you going to be a fireman like your old man? Maybe, he said, frowning as if seriously considering the matter. Or a dinosaur hunter. A tough call, I chuckled. Sarah placed a plate of pancakes in front of me, and I caught her hand before she could move away. Thanks, sweetie. She smiled quickly, but her gaze was somewhere to the side, as if she was looking through me. Eat, she said, returning to the stove. You'll need your strength. I looked at her, trying to figure out what was wrong. She was going through the usual routine: pancakes, coffee, Tommy's lunchbox, but it was all mechanical, like she was acting. I told myself it was okay. She was tired, and so was I. Teaching kids is no joke, especially first graders who have the attention span of squirrels on caffeine. What's going on with the meetings? I asked, cutting pancakes. The usual, she replied without turning around. The kids are mostly fine. Some parents need a little encouragement to read with their kids at home. You're good at that, I said. Nudges. She laughed, quietly, more out of politeness than sincerity. Trying. Breakfast flew by in a stream of Tommy's chatter, something about a new kid at school who swore he'd seen a bear in his yard, and then it was time to get ready. I dropped Tommy off at school, his backpack bouncing as he ran to his friends and headed to the unit. It was a clear Colorado morning, the kind where the air is crisp and the mountains are sharp against a blue sky that hurts your eyes. But that feeling from last night lingered, a quiet restlessness I couldn't shake. Sarah had been my anchor, the one who'd kept me afloat after the core, after the nightmares that still sometimes crept up. She'd made this life, Pine Creek, Tommy, home real. So why did she seem to be slipping away, like smoke I couldn't hold? At the unit, I threw myself into my work, checking gear, running drills, swapping stories with the guys about the fire the night before. They sometimes called me Sarge, a reference to my past, and I didn't mind because it meant I was known, trusted. But even as I worked, I thought about Sarah, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, the way her hand was in mine, but not quite. By evening, when I returned home, the house was quiet again. Tommy was busy in his room, where muffled sounds came from the floor as the dinosaurs engaged in another battle for the bed. I took off my jacket, hung my keys on the hook by the door, and went into the kitchen. Sarah sat at the table. In front of her were open notebooks, a red pen in her fingers, a cup of unfinished tea. She moved the pen along the margins, making notes, slightly pursing her lips. Her hair was pinned up, but a few strands had come loose and were falling on her forehead. It seemed she didn't even notice. I leaned against the doorframe and just watched. Not on purpose, not to sneak up on her, just, I needed half a minute to figure out how to talk to her. "Having a tough day?" I asked, trying not to sound too tense. She flinched slightly, as if I had pulled her out of another room and not just addressed her. "Long," she said, without looking. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, slowly, as if prolonging the pause. "A lot of paperwork. And you too?" "About the same." I took a step closer, leaning on the edge of the table. "Listen, are you okay?" She looked at me. Quickly, briefly. There was surprise and some weariness in that look, as if I had asked a question she had long been speechless for. "Why do you ask?" she asked, not coldly, but with a subtle tension. Not defensive, more like caution. "I don't know." I shrugged. "It's just, you're kind of here, but it's like you're not. We barely talk. Just business. Who's picking up Tommy? What to buy? Did you remember to take out the trash? Everything on the list." She looked away, put her pen away, and folded her hands. "It wasn't on purpose, Jack. It just piled up. Everything at once. School, Tommy, the constant race against time. I don't." She trailed off, as if afraid to finish. "I don't have time to be myself." "Who are you now?" I asked. My voice was soft, but the question was sharp. I didn't want to prick her. I just wanted to understand. I wanted to reach out. She was silent for a long time. Then she smiled, not ironically, but with that crooked smile that happens when a person feels the walls moving closer. "You know what's the strangest thing? Sometimes I think I have everything: a child, a job, you. And then there's silence, and it's empty. As if I'm living by inertia. Not because I don't love, not because I want something else, but because I don't know how to stop and say it out loud." I looked at her hands, her slightly trembling fingers, in her eyes, in which there were no tears, but there was something more terrible indifference to her own fatigue. "I didn't know," I said quietly. "I didn't know myself," she answered, "until I started choking. And it's not you I need to leave. Just get back to myself. At least a little bit." I nodded, not because I understood everything, but because I suddenly understood the main thing. She's not leaving. She's still here. She just doesn't know what to do with it anymore, just like me. I could have said something right, something strong. But instead, I just walked closer and, without asking, took her hand. Quietly, unobtrusively. Mornings in our house in Pine Creek always began with a familiar rhythm, like the breathing of a sleeping town. The sun slid lazily through the curtains, casting golden streaks across the hardwood floors I had sanded myself 2 summers ago. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, while Sarah bustled about the stove, making oatmeal for Tommy. Her movements were precise, like a dancer who knew every step, but there was a mechanical detachment to them, as if her mind were elsewhere. Tommy swung his legs under the table, his spoon clanking against the bowl as he drew invisible patterns in his oatmeal. "Dad, did you see Bobby score a goal yesterday?" he asked, his eyes shining with delight. "He ran across the field like a rocket." I smiled, taking another sip of coffee. "I saw it, champion. Bobby is a real star. But you looked good on the field, too." Tommy grinned, his cheeks turning pink at the praise. "Yeah, but I want to be like you. Save people. Or maybe hunt dinosaurs." Sarah placed a glass of orange juice in front of him, her smile soft but somehow forced. Eat, Tommy, or you'll miss the school bus, she said without looking at me. I watched her as she put the frying pan in the sink. Something about the way she moved, the way she avoided my gaze, was like a splinter under my skin. But I pushed it away. I'd been on edge since the fire on Aspen Road, adrenaline still pumping through my veins, and maybe I was just seeing things that weren't there. We were a family as strong as the mountains outside our window. Sarah had been my rock, the one who'd kept me going after the Marine Corps, when nightmares of sand and gunfire still woke me at night. She couldn't be distant. Not my Sarah. Mom's friend Ryan came over while you were gone, Tommy said suddenly, picking at his oatmeal. His voice was light, as if he were mentioning that it was raining outside. I froze, the cup of coffee stopped halfway to my lips. Ryan, I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Who else, Ryan? Tommy shrugged, not looking up from his bowl. Well, the one in the cap. He brought Mom coffee, said it was her favorite. Sarah turned away from the sink, her face calm, but I noticed her fingers trembling slightly as she dried her hands on the towel. Just a coworker, Jack, she said, her voice soft but taut, like a string about to snap. Ryan teaches high school. Come in sometimes to discuss school business. I nodded, placing the cup on the table. I see, I said, though something stirred in my chest, like a faint alarm. But I brushed it aside. Sarah was a teacher, her world full of coworkers, parents, endless meetings. Of course, someone would drop by. This was Pine Creek, a small town where everyone knew everyone else. Nothing strange. I'm going to get ready, I said, standing up. Tommy, don't forget your backpack. He nodded, already engrossed in his oatmeal, and I glanced at Sarah. She was standing at the sink, her back straight but her shoulders slightly hunched, as if she were carrying something heavy. I wanted to go over, put my arm around her, say something that would take us back to when we could talk about anything, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I went upstairs to change for work. It was a normal day at the firehouse, checking equipment, training, joking with the guys. We were discussing the fire the day before, as usual, going over the details like soldiers after a battle. My partner, Danny, clapped me on the shoulder as I was checking the hoses. Sarge, you were like a goddamn machine last night, he said, grinning. That family on Aspen Road, they're going to worship you now. I chuckled, but my thoughts were somewhere else. I was just doing my job, I replied, tightening the clamp on the oxygen tank. But Tommy's words about Ryan still rang in my head like a distant alarm. I wasn't jealous, or so I thought. I'd learned to keep my temper in check in the Corps, to not let my emotions get the better of me. But something about that phrase, Mom's friend Ryan, stuck in my head like a pebble in my shoe. I told myself it was nonsense. Sarah had been devoted to me, to our family, to our home. She'd been the one who held us together, the one who'd made this town a place I could breathe after all those years in the desert. But still, why hadn't she mentioned Ryan before? When I got home, the sun was setting, painting the sky above the mountains in crimson and gold. Tommy was playing in the yard, racing his cars around a makeshift track made of sticks and rocks. I sat down next to him, watching him push the red pickup truck across the finish line with a serious expression. Who wins? I asked, picking up one of the cars and rolling it between my fingers. This one, Tommy pointed to the blue tractor. It's the fastest. I laughed, but my gaze slid to the kitchen window, where Sarah was cooking. She moved with the same grace as always, but I couldn't help but notice the way her shoulders tensed as she turned toward the stove. Hey, Tommy, I said, trying to keep my voice light. That Ryan guy, does he come around often? Tommy frowned, concentrating on his typewriter. I don't know. Sometimes. He wears a cap and always brings Mom coffee. Said it was her favorite. He looked up, his face so open, so innocent, I felt a twinge of guilt for even asking. He's funny. Told me about the stars once. I nodded, forcing myself to smile. Cool, I said, though my chest tightened. Come on, can you help me with dinner? Tommy jumped up, forgetting about his cars, and ran into the house. I followed him, but the words about Ryan kept spinning in my head like a record with a stuck needle. the cap, the coffee, the stars. They were small, trivial things, but they added up to a picture I didn't want to see. The kitchen smelled of roast chicken and rosemary. Sarah stood at the stove, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, her cheeks flushed from the heat. She looked perfect, as always the perfect wife, the perfect mother. But as she turned to set her plate on the table, her eyes met mine, and there was a flicker of something in them, not fear, not guilt, but something I couldn't quite place. "Long day?" I asked, helping Tommy up onto the chair. "As usual," she replied, her voice even but with a hint of weariness. "And you?" "Nothing special," I said, watching her carve the chicken. "I was just thinking about what Tommy said this morning. About Ryan." Her knife froze for a second, almost imperceptibly, but I saw it. "Oh," she said, without looking up. "Yeah, he's just a colleague. He comes over sometimes to discuss school projects. Nothing special." "He brings you coffee," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Tommy said he's your favorite." She laughed, but it was forced, as if she was forcing herself. "Yeah, he knows I like lattes. It's just sweet of him." I nodded, but something inside me didn't want to calm down. I was a Marine. I knew how to read people, how to notice details that others missed. But this was Sarah, my Sarah, the woman who knew me better than I knew myself. I didn't want to be the guy who made a scene over a cup of coffee. "I see," I said, cutting off a piece of chicken for Tommy. "Just asking." She smiled, but it was the same smile as that morning, polite but empty. We ate in silence, broken only by Tommy's chatter about his cars and how he wanted to build the biggest track in the world. I laughed, played along, but my eyes kept returning to Sarah. She ate slowly, her movements careful, but they lacked the ease I loved. She was here, but somewhere else. After dinner, I helped clear the table while Tommy ran off to watch cartoons. Sarah and I stood at the sink, me washing dishes and her drying them. It was our ritual, a moment when we could talk, laugh, just be us. But today, the silence between us was heavy, like smoke before a fire. "Are you sure everything's okay?" I asked, handing her the plate. "You're kind of, I don't know, not like usual." She took the plate, her fingers lightly touching mine, but she didn't look up. "I'm fine, Jack. Just a lot of things to do at school. Parent-teacher conferences, lesson plans. You know how it is." "I know," I said, but I didn't believe her. I knew her too well, knew how she laughed when she was happy, how her eyes lit up when she talked about her students. This wasn't that. This was something else, something she didn't want to show me. I wanted to press, to ask who this Ryan guy was, why he came when I wasn't, why she hadn't told me about him. But I wasn't that kind of person. I was the one who put out fires, built houses, protected my family. I wasn't the one who interrogated. "If something is wrong, you will tell me, right?" I asked, looking at her. She finally looked up, and there was something in her eyes that wasn't a lie, but wasn't the truth either. "Of course, Jack," she said, her voice soft, almost gentle. "It's all right." I nodded, but there was a feeling growing in my chest that I couldn't name. It wasn't suspicion, not really. It was something deeper, like a crack in the foundation of the house I'd spent years building. I told myself I had it under control. I was Jack Harper, the man who could pull his family out of a burning house, who could build a life from nothing. I could handle anything. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to Sarah's steady breathing beside me, I couldn't stop thinking about Ryan, about the coffee, about the cap, about the stars. These were small things, sparks that might go unnoticed. But I knew how fires started. Sometimes all it takes is one spark to burn everything to the ground. The morning was cold in Pine Creek, with that crisp mountain air that chills you to the bone, but also makes you feel alive. I sat behind the wheel of my truck, watching Tommy run to the school bus, his backpack bouncing on his back, his breath puffing out in the morning chill. Sarah stood on the porch, wrapped in her cardigan, waving after him. Her smile was warm, maternal, but when she turned to me, there was that same shadow in her eyes that I had begun to notice more and more often, elusive as smoke slipping through my fingers. I turned off the engine and got out of the car, feeling the gravel crunch under my boots. "Are you late today?" she asked, her voice light but somehow strained, as if she was trying to fill the silence. "An ordinary day," I replied, putting my hands in my jacket pockets. "Maybe I'll stay late if there's a call. And you?" "Meetings until this evening," she said, already turning towards the door. "Then we need to prepare lessons for next week." I nodded, but my gaze lingered on her. Her movements were too quick, too practiced, like she wanted to get away. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired from my shift, but Tommy's words about Ryan still rang in my head like a distant alarm. I wasn't the type to go through other people's things or eavesdrop on conversations. I was a Marine, for fuck's sake, a man who trusted his people, his team. But Sarah, she wasn't just my team. She was my home. The day dragged on at the firehouse. We cleaned equipment, checked oxygen tanks, and joked about how Danny almost dropped the hose last week. But my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about Sarah, how she had changed not suddenly, not in a way that was obvious, but slowly, like a crack creeping across glass. She had become colder, more distant, as if an invisible wall had grown between us. I thought about how we used to talk for hours, laughing at silly things, how she would cuddle up to me at night, her skin warm and soft under my fingers. Now she turned away, citing fatigue, a headache, anything to avoid intimacy. Last night, I tried. After Tommy fell asleep and the house was silent, I lay down next to her, feeling her breathing slow as if she were feigning sleep. I ran my hand down her waist, my fingers sliding under the hem of her shirt, brushing against her smooth skin. I leaned closer, my lips finding her neck, and I inhaled her scent lavender mixed with something else, something foreign that I couldn't immediately place. "Jack," she murmured, her voice sleepy but firm. "I'm tired. Not today." I froze, my fingers still on her waist, but I felt her tense under my touch. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice soft, but something hot was already boiling inside, a mixture of desire and irritation. "You've been, I don't know, distant lately." She turned to face me, her eyes shining in the dim light of the bedroom. "Just a lot going on, Jack. School, Tommy, all of it." She reached up to stroke my cheek, but her touch was quick, almost formal. "Let's go to sleep, okay?" I nodded, turning away, but there was a feeling growing in my chest that I didn't want to name. It wasn't just disappointment. It was something deeper, like I was losing her, piece by piece, and I didn't know how to stop it. When I got home that night, the house was quiet, except for the soft light from the kitchen that filtered into the living room. Tommy was at the neighbors, playing with their son, and Sarah hadn't returned from school yet. I threw my jacket on the coat rack and went into the kitchen to get a beer from the fridge. But when I got to the sink, I froze. There was an empty coffee cup there, not the one we usually used, with the logo of the local coffee shop, but something different, a fancy design I'd never seen before. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, feeling that uncomfortable twitch in my chest again. There was a faint trace of latte at the bottom of the glass, the same one Tommy said was her favorite. I put the glass back down, but my gaze fell on her phone, lying on the table. The screen was upside down, as if she'd placed it that way on purpose. It was a small thing, but it cut me like a knife. Sarah never hid her phone. It used to be everywhere, on the couch, on the nightstand, on the kitchen table, face up, with endless notifications from parents of students or coworkers. Now it was always next to her, always upside down, always locked. I told myself it didn't matter. People changed their habits. Tiredness, work, stress, all of those things could explain her behavior. But then I smelled it, faint but distinct, lingering in the air. Not her lavender, not my cologne, but something else. A man's perfume, with notes of cedar and something sharp, as if someone had just been here, in my house, and left this trail behind them. I inhaled deeply, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the scent was real, clinging to the edges of my consciousness like a warning. I heard the front door open and quickly stepped away from the sink. Sarah walked in, her cheeks pink from the cold, holding a stack of notebooks. "You're early," she said, her voice light but wary. No calls today, I replied, watching her place her notebooks on the table, carefully avoiding the phone. I decided to come back early. She nodded, taking off her coat and hanging it on the hook. Okay, Tommy is at the neighbor's. I'll pick him up in an hour. I looked at her, trying to find something in her face that would explain my doubts. She was beautiful as always, dark hair slightly disheveled from a long day, eyes that could be so warm when she wanted them to be. But now there was a wall in them, invisible but palpable. Do you want me to take him? I offered, hoping that talking about Tommy would get us back on solid ground. No, I can handle it, she said quickly, too quickly. You must be tired. I wasn't tired. I was on edge, my nerves taut as strings ready to snap. I wanted to ask about the glass, about the smell, about the phone, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I said, I'll go take a shower. She nodded, already turning to the stack of notebooks, and I felt that distance again, that invisible wall that was growing thicker with each passing moment. Later that night, after Tommy was tucked into bed, I sat in the living room, holding a beer and looking at the TV but not seeing it. The news droned on about a storm coming down from the mountains, but my mind was elsewhere. The smell of that perfume still lingered in my mind, sharp and foreign, like a stranger's fingerprint in my home. I thought about the coffee cup, the phone, the way Sarah had pulled away from me the night before. It all fit together like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. When she came downstairs, dressed in her pajamas, her hair loose around her shoulders, I felt that same familiar pull toward her. She was still the woman I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd laughed at my stupid jokes, the one who'd held my hand on the darkest nights after the core. I set my beer down on the table and stood, crossing the room toward her. Sarah, I said, my voice low as I took her hand. Come here. She hesitated, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't read, but she let me pull her closer. I wrapped my arms around her waist, feeling the warmth of her body through the thin fabric of her shirt. I leaned down, kissing her neck, my hands sliding to her hips, holding her close. I wanted her, not just her body, but her the Sarah who had melted into me before, who wanted me as much as I wanted her. Jack, she said, her voice soft but firm as she placed her hand on my chest, gently pushing me away. Not today. I'm just not in the mood. I froze, my hands still on her hips, the warmth of her skin beneath my fingers now seeming like a mockery. You're never in the mood lately, I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. There was a sharpness in my voice, sharper than I intended, and I saw her flinch. It's not like that, she said, stepping back, her arms crossed over her chest like a shield. I'm just tired, Jack. You know how it is. Do I know? I asked, my voice quieter now, but the frustration boiling inside. Because it feels like you're somewhere else, Sarah, like you're not with me. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I thought I saw something: guilt, fear, maybe even sadness. But then she looked away, her jaw tense. You think too much, she said, her voice clipped. I'm just tired. That's all. She turned and walked upstairs, leaving me standing in the living room, the air heavy with all that was unsaid. I wanted to go after her, demand answers, shake her until she told me what was going on. But I didn't. I wasn't that kind of man. I was Jack Harper, the man who could run into a burning building without flinching, who could build a house from scratch, who could protect his family from anything. Except maybe this. The next morning, I woke before dawn, unable to sleep. I stood in the kitchen, staring at that damn coffee cup again. It was still there, in the sink, a silent accusation. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and noticed a faint smudge of lipstick on the rim, not quite the same shade as Sarah's, but close enough that it could be hers. Or maybe it wasn't. My mind was spinning, looking for patterns where there might be none. When Sarah came downstairs, she froze when she saw me with this glass. You're early, she said, her voice cautious. I couldn't sleep, I replied, putting the glass back. Whose is this? She looked at him, her face unreadable. Mine, she said. I picked up coffee on the way home yesterday. I nodded, But I didn't believe her. Not quite. The pieces fell into place: the phone, the perfume, the glass, her coldness in bed. I wasn't stupid. I'd seen enough in the core to know when someone was hiding something. But this was Sarah, my wife, the mother of my son. I didn't want to believe she could be anyone other than the woman I'd built my life around. "Jack," she said, her voice softer now as she stepped closer. "You're acting weird. What's going on?" I looked at her, searching for the truth in her face. "You tell me," I said, my voice low, "because I'm starting to ask questions." Her eyes widened just for a moment before she covered it up with a laugh. "You're getting paranoid," she said, but there was a slight tremor in her voice, a crack in her armor. "I'm going to take Tommy to school." She left, and I let her go, but the uneasiness in my chest grew, spreading like wildfire. I had no proof, not yet, but I knew what I felt. And what I felt was the shadow of something or someone standing between us, like a reflection in glass I couldn't see clearly. The night in Pine Creek was quiet, but not the quiet that comforts. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, like the silence before a storm, when the air is heavy and your nerves are on edge. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Sarah's even breathing next to me. She was asleep, or pretending to be, her dark hair spread out across the pillow, her face so peaceful, so familiar. But now that familiarity felt foreign, like a mask covering something I didn't want to see. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Thoughts of the coffee cup, the scent of someone else's perfume, her upside-down phone swirled in my head like shards of glass, digging deeper with every turn. I turned, watching her silhouette in the dim moonlight filtering through the curtains. Her chest rose and fell, and I remembered how this sight had once comforted me, how her warmth had been my refuge after nightmares of sand and blood. Now her proximity only heightened the anxiety, as if I were lying next to a stranger. I knew I shouldn't do this. I knew it was a violation, that this was not my path. But I could no longer ignore the signals that my mind, trained by years in the Corps, had picked up with unerring accuracy. I stood quietly, my bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. Sarah didn't move. I crept downstairs to the living room, where her tablet sat on the coffee table next to her upside-down phone. She always left it there, as if she weren't afraid I'd peek. Or maybe she was so confident in her lie that she didn't think it necessary. I picked up the tablet, its smooth surface cool in my hands. The screen lit up, demanding a password. I knew it: Tommy's birthday. She never changed her passwords. She trusted me. Or maybe she just didn't think I'd go that far. I punched in the numbers, and the screen came to life. My fingers hovered over the messaging icon. It was a line I hadn't crossed before. In the Corps, we were taught to trust our team, but we were also taught to recognize when someone was cracking under pressure, when someone was hiding the truth. I tapped the app, scrolling through the chats until I saw a name: Ryan. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. A veteran. I knew how to wait. I knew how to keep my cool. I opened the conversation, and the world I knew began to crumble. The first thing I saw was a photo. Sarah, laughing, her hair down, her eyes sparkling, like she was the girl I'd met 10 years ago again. She was standing in the park, the same one Tommy and I used to walk in on weekends, her cheeks pink from the wind, holding that same latte. The caption read, "You know how to make my day." Sent by Ryan. I scrolled up, and each message was a punch to the gut. "You were incredible today," he wrote 3 days ago. Her reply: "You were too. I can't stop thinking about it." I gripped the tablet so tightly my knuckles turned white. My eyes scanned the lines and saw more. A photo from her of Sarah in the school library, her blouse unbuttoned a little lower than usual, a smile on her lips that wasn't directed at me. "For you," she'd written. His response: "Oh my God, you drive me crazy." Another photo from him of a man in a dark shirt, his face gone, just his torso, with the caption, "Waiting to meet you." I felt the blood pounding in my temples, but I forced myself to keep reading. The texts grew more explicit. "I want to feel your hands," she'd written a week ago. His reply: "Soon, I promise. I can't wait." There were messages about meeting up at a coffee shop on the edge of town, in a park after work, at a motel outside Pine Creek I'd only heard about. "You make me feel alive," she'd written one night, when I was probably asleep in this very bed, thinking she was there. I scrolled on, and each word was a burn, deeper than any fire I'd ever walked into. There were the intimate messages, the kind that made your stomach churn. She wrote about how he touched her, how she wanted him, how their encounters were her heart-pounding secret. He responded with descriptions of what he would do to her next, his words crude, but she seemed to be playing along, her responses just as frank, just as greedy. I saw the dates some of the messages were sent late at night, when I was on shift, putting out fires, saving lives, thinking my own was safe. I closed the tablet, placing it back on the table as carefully as if it might explode. My hands shook, but I balled them into fists, forcing myself to breathe. I was a veteran. I knew how to take a punch, how to wait, how to keep my emotions at bay. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was my home, my wife, my life. And everything I'd built, everything I'd fought for, now felt as fragile as glass ready to shatter. I went back to the bedroom and lay down next to Sarah, but I couldn't bring myself to touch her. She was asleep, her breathing even, as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had changed. I lay there, staring into the darkness, and I felt something inside me crack, like old wood under fire. I wanted to break into her sleep, to shake her, to demand answers. I wanted to scream, to break something, to release the poison that was now coursing through my veins. But I did nothing. I just lay there, listening to her breathe, and thinking about how far she had come from me. Morning came too quickly, with gray light filtering through the curtains. Sarah was already in the kitchen, making breakfast for Tommy. I walked down, feeling each step in my chest, as if I were carrying something heavy. She stood at the stove, her movements the same as always, precise, graceful, but I saw them differently now. Each gesture seemed part of the mask she wore to hide the truth. "Good morning," she said without turning around. Her voice was light, but I detected tension in it, as if she sensed that something was wrong. "Morning," I said, sitting down at the table. Tommy was already there, chatting about his new car, but I barely heard him. My eyes followed Sarah, the way she moved, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me. "Are you okay?" she asked, finally looking at me. Her eyes were the same as always, but now I saw lies in them, or so it seemed. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "I just didn't get enough sleep." She nodded, turning back to the stove, and I felt something hot boiling inside me, something I couldn't let go. I wanted to grab her hand, push her against the wall, ask who Ryan was, why she did it, how she could. But I couldn't, not with Tommy, not now. I drove Tommy to school, his chatter about dinosaurs and football like distant noise. I answered automatically, my mind on the messages, the words I couldn't forget. When I got back to my unit, I threw myself into work, checking equipment, cleaning hoses, helping the guys with drills. Work had always been my escape, a place to drown out the chaos in my head. But today, even that wasn't helping. Every message, every photo, was in front of my eyes like stills from a movie I didn't want to watch. Danny noticed that I was out of it. "Sarge, where have you been?" he asked, clapping me on the shoulder. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," I lied, looking away. I couldn't tell him. I couldn't tell anyone. This was mine and Sarah's, and I had to deal with it myself. I returned home in the evening, but home no longer felt like home. It was a place where everything was saturated with lies, every corner, every object. Sarah was in the kitchen, cooking dinner, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, the same smile I once loved on her face. Now she seemed a stranger to me. "Long day?" she asked, placing a plate of pasta on the table. "As usual," I answered, sitting down. My voice was even, but inside I was like a taut string, ready to snap. We ate in silence, broken only by Tommy's chatter about school. I looked at Sarah, trying to find the woman I knew, but all I saw was her mask. After dinner, I helped clear the table, standing next to her at the sink, as we had done hundreds of times. But now, every gesture, every look in her eyes seemed like part of a game I didn't understand. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, wiping her plate. Her voice was soft, but there was a note of caution in it. I looked at her, my eyes met hers, and for a moment I wanted to say everything about the tablet, about the messages, about the pain that was tearing me apart inside. But instead I said, "Yes, just thinking about work." She nodded, looking away, and I knew she knew. Maybe not about the tablet, but she could tell I was suspicious, and that only made me more determined. I wasn't one to act rashly. I was a veteran. I knew how to wait, I knew how to plan, I knew how to keep my temper. But now I knew the truth, and that truth was deeper than any burn I'd ever suffered. It was like poison, slowly coursing through my veins, and I had to find a way to deal with it. Not for me, but for Tommy, for what was left of our family. I went to bed that night, keeping my distance from Sarah. She didn't notice or pretended not to notice, but I knew it was just the beginning. I could see the fire that was starting between us, and I was going to face it. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. Because I was Jack Harper, and I wasn't going down without a fight. The darkness in our house wasn't just the absence of light. It was a tangible thing, like a heavy blanket that settled over your shoulders and made it hard to breathe. I sat in the living room, in an old leather chair that creaked under my weight, staring at the cold TV without turning it on. I held a mug of cold coffee in my hands, but I wasn't drinking it, just holding it to keep my hands busy, so I wouldn't curl them into fists and break something. Sarah was asleep upstairs, or pretending to be, and I could still taste the messages I'd read on her tablet the night before. Every word, every photo, was like a knife cutting deep, but I wouldn't let myself break. I was a veteran. I could take a punch. I could wait. And now I was going to act. The Corps taught me that chaotic decisions lead to defeat. In combat, you plan, you evaluate, you choose your moment. The fires I faced every day were the same. You don't rush into a fire without preparation, without a map, without a strategy. And now, as my life began to smolder like dry wood before a forest fire, I decided to approach it the same way, with cold precision, with a plan. I knew I couldn't just make a scene. Screaming, accusations, broken dishes, that wasn't my way. Sarah was smart, she would deny it. She would slip between truth and lies like water through her fingers. I needed proof, irrefutable, the kind I could hold in my hands like a hot coal, and I wanted to see it with my own eyes. Not words on a screen, but her actions, her choices. I wanted to know how far she had gone. The morning was gray, with low clouds clinging to the mountain peaks. I sat at the kitchen table, watching Sarah pour Tommy's juice. Her movements were the same as always, smooth and practiced, but now I saw something artificial in them, as if she were acting. Tommy babbled on about how he wanted to build a castle out of Lego, and I played along, smiling even though I was burning inside. "Hey, Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice even, as if nothing had changed. "I've got an internship coming up. 3 days in the mountains. Rescue work. The boss says it could help with a promotion." She froze for a second, her hand holding the jug of juice hovering in the air. "Oh," she said, setting the jug on the table. "That's great, Jack. When?" "I'm leaving tomorrow," I answered, looking into her eyes. "I'll be back Friday evening." Her face didn't flinch, but I noticed her fingers tighten slightly on the edge of the table, as if she were trying to keep her balance. "Okay," she said, smiling that same empty smile I now hated. "We'll get through this. Right, Tommy?" Tommy nodded, not looking up from his plate of toast. I looked at Sarah, trying to catch a hint of truth in her eyes, but she was like a closed book that I could no longer read. "Are you sure?" I asked, adding a little concern to my voice. "If anything, I can refuse. It's not necessary." "No, no," she said quickly, too quickly. "It's important to you. Go. We'll be fine." I nodded, sipping my coffee, which had long since gone cold. Everything inside me was boiling, but I kept it under control, like I would keep my sights on a target in the desert. She didn't know I'd seen her messages. She didn't know I was no longer the Jack who trusted her blindly. and I was going to use that. The plan had been brewing in my head since the night I lay awake, listening to her breathe. I wasn't going to leave. The internship was a lie, though I'd done everything I could to make it seem real, even talking to my boss about possible courses to cover up the lie. Instead, I was going to stay in Pine Creek, but not at home. I'd made arrangements with our neighbor, Frank, an old widower who lived across the street. He was an ex-cop, a man who knew when not to ask questions. I told him I needed to watch the house for a few days, without going into details. He simply nodded and offered me the key to his guest room. But surveillance isn't just about sitting and watching. I came prepared. At the firehouse, we had cameras we used for training small, discreet, high resolution. I grabbed a couple, ostensibly to test them, and set them up around the house while Sarah was at school and Tommy was at practice. One in the living room, tucked among the books on the shelf, overlooking the front door. Another in the kitchen, behind the coffee machine, where it would pick up any conversation. I set them to record and connected them to an app on my phone. It wasn't hard. The technology I'd used to save people was now used to protect my family, or what was left of them. And then there was the drone. I had an old quadcopter I'd bought a couple of years ago to film the mountains for Tommy. He loved watching them hover over our hikes. I checked the battery, updated the firmware, and hid it in a shed behind the house where Sarah never looked. It could hover over the backyard, unnoticeable in the dark, and give me a view from above. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. I wasn't going to miss a single detail. The next day, I packed my bag as if I were really leaving. Sarah was watching me from the bedroom doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, the same forced smile on her face. "Be careful in the mountains," she said, her voice soft but false, as if she were reading from a script. "Always careful," I replied, throwing my bag over my shoulder. "I'll call when I get there." I kissed her cheek, feeling the coolness of her skin against my lips, and walked away without looking back. Tommy was at school, so I didn't say goodbye to him. That would have been too hard. Instead, I got in my truck, drove a couple of streets away, and parked at Frank's. His house was old but cozy, overlooking our street. I settled into the guest room, where the window looked directly onto our house. From here, I could see the front door, the driveway, even part of the backyard. The drone was ready, the cameras were on, my phone was charged. I was ready. Everything inside me was on fire. Every message I read, every photo I saw was like a white-hot coal, but I didn't let myself explode. I was a Marine. I knew how to control myself, how to wait, how to plan, like an operation. And this was my operation. Not to destroy, but to understand. To know what to do next. The first day was quiet. I sat by the window, watching Sarah come home from school, pick up Tommy from the neighbors. They walked into the house, the living room light came on, and I could see their silhouettes through the curtains. The cameras were rolling, recording every move. I checked the app. Sarah was making dinner. Tommy was playing with his cars on the floor. Everything looked as it should, but I knew this was just the beginning. By evening, I had launched the drone. It rose silently above the backyard, its camera beaming images to my phone. I could see our house from above the roof I'd fixed myself last summer, the garden Sarah loved so much. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing yet, but I didn't relax. I knew she wouldn't act right away. She was cautious, smart. She was waiting until she was sure I was really gone. I sat in the dark of the guest room, the light from my phone screen on my face. Frank popped his head in and brought me coffee, but didn't ask any questions. "If you need anything, just tell me," he muttered before leaving. "Thank you," I replied, without taking my eyes off the screen. The night dragged on. I watched the security footage, the empty yard, the silence that seemed louder than any fire. Everything inside me was burning anger, pain, betrayal, but I kept it under control. I was Jack Harper, a man who could walk into hell and come out whole. And I was going to come out of this hole, even if it broke my heart. The night was cold, like a knife cutting into skin. I sat in Frank's spare room in the dark, clutching my phone as the drone's feed flickered on the screen. My house, my fucking house, sat before me on that small screen, like the set of a movie I didn't want to be in. The backyard was empty, the lights dimmed, but I knew it was calm before the storm. Sarah thought I was in the mountains on a make-believe internship, and I could feel her waiting for her moment to make her move. I was ready. My cameras were rolling, my drone was charged, and I was a grenade with the pin pulled, but I still had control. A veteran. I knew how to wait. I watched the house all day, but nothing happened. Sarah came home from school, picked up Tommy, and they ate dinner like everything was normal. But I saw her every move she made, the way she checked her phone, the way her eyes darted around the room, like she was waiting for something. Or someone. I knew she wouldn't call him right away. She was too smart for that. But by the evening of the second day, when Tommy was staying the night at a friend's house, I felt the air thicken. Something was about to happen. I launched the drone, its low hum fading into the stillness of the night. It rose above the backyard, hovering just high enough to escape detection. The camera showed a clear view of our house, the roof, the garden, the bedroom window. I checked my indoor camera app. The living room was empty, the kitchen too. Sarah was sitting on the couch, her phone glowing in her hands, and I could see her fingers typing a quick text. My stomach clenched, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. I knew what I was going to see. I was ready. And then I saw him. A black pickup truck, unfamiliar, pulled up in front of our house. A man got out tall, wearing a dark jacket and the same cap Tommy had talked about. Ryan. His face was hard to see in the darkness, but I knew it was him. He walked toward the front door with such confidence, like this was his home, his life. I gripped the phone so tightly the plastic creaked, but I didn't let myself fall. I watched as he knocked, as the door opened, and Sarah ushered him inside. The camera in the living room sprang to life. I saw them, Sarah, in the flowing dress I'd once loved, smiling at him, her eyes bright, as if she were alive again, as if I hadn't been the one making her heart beat. They hugged, his hands sliding down her back, lower than I could bear. She laughed, her voice soft, the way it had been when we first started dating. I felt the anger coursing through my veins like molten lava, but I kept my cool. I recorded everything: his entrance, their laughter, their embrace. Each frame was a blow, but I didn't look away. They headed upstairs, and my heart sank as I switched to the camera in the bedroom. I'd set it up yesterday, hidden behind an old framed photograph of Sarah and me at the lake, laughing, happy. Now the photograph stared back at them as they walked into our bedroom. Sarah closed the door, and I watched as she reached for him, her fingers unbuttoning his shirt, and he pulled her against him, his lips on her neck, her arms, her lips. They fell onto the bed, our bed, and I watched as her dress slid to the floor, as his hands explored her body, as she arched beneath him, making sounds that had once been just for me. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. My insides were burning, like I was on fire, but I didn't move. I watched them have sex in my house, in my bed, her moans echoing in my ears, his hands on her hips, her fingers in his hair. This wasn't just cheating, this was stealing everything I'd built, everything I'd fought for. I wanted to storm in there, smash his face in, throw her out of my life, but I made myself wait. I was a veteran. I knew that impulses kill. I wrote it all down, every moan, every look, every lie. When they were done, Sarah was lying next to him, her head on his chest, and he was whispering to her, his fingers playing with her hair. I saw her smile like he was her world. My world. I turned off the drone, returned it to the barn through the app, and checked that all the footage was saved. My tablet was full of evidence: their embrace, their passion, their betrayal. I could use it to destroy her, but I didn't want to destroy her. I wanted the truth, and I wanted them both to know that I saw it. I stood up, put on my jacket, and walked quietly out of Frank's house. The street was empty, only the light from the street lamps glinting off the wet asphalt from the recent rain. I crossed the road, my steps silent, like those days when I crept through the desert, knowing that one wrong sound could cost me my life. The key turned in the lock of our front door, and I walked in, closing it behind me so quietly that not even the air moved. The house was thick with their presence. I could smell his perfume, the same cedar, sharp scent I'd caught earlier. The living room was empty, but the coffee cup, that damn cup again, was on the table, next to her bag. I walked up the stairs, each step a step toward the scaffold, but I didn't hesitate. I was ready. The bedroom door was ajar. I could see them, Sarah wrapped in a sheet, her hair disheveled, and Ryan sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling on his shirt. They didn't notice me until I walked in. Sarah turned first, her eyes wide, her face pale, as if she'd seen a ghost. "Jack," she gasped, her voice shaking, panic surging through her. You're supposed to be in the mountains." Ryan jumped up, his face a mixture of fear and insolence. He was taller than me, but I knew that meant nothing. I looked at him, my gaze cold as steel, and he froze, as if I had a knife to his throat. I didn't say a word. I just stared, and that was enough to make his confidence begin to crumble. Sarah jumped up, clutching the sheet to her chest, her eyes darting between me and him. "Jack, it's not what you think," she began, her voice high and desperate. "I can explain." I raised my hand, stopping her. My voice was low, hard as concrete. "Get out of my house," I said, looking at Ryan. He opened his mouth to speak, but I didn't give him a chance. In one motion, I stepped forward, my fist connecting with his jaw with such force that he flew back against the wall, tripping over a chair. Blood spurted from his lip, but I didn't finish him off. One blow was enough. He knew what would happen if he tried to get up. "Jack, please," Sarah was sobbing, her face wet with tears, but I didn't look at her. I couldn't. Not now. Ryan stood up, clutching his jaw, and backed toward the door, his eyes full of fear. He grabbed his shoes and stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the stairs. I heard the front door slam, the engine of his truck revving as he sped away. I turned to Sarah. She was sitting on the bed, her shoulders shaking, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Jack," she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't mean to." I walked over to the camera hidden behind the photo and turned it off. The recording was done. I turned to Sarah, my gaze empty, like ashes after a fire. "Don't say anything," I said, my voice as cold as the winter wind. "Just don't say anything." She was sobbing, her hands reaching for me, but I stepped back. I couldn't touch her, couldn't even stand there. All I could see was her body beneath him, her smile for him, her lies to me. I turned and walked out of the bedroom, leaving her alone with her tears, her guilt, her betrayal. I went downstairs, sat in my chair, and stared into the darkness. My home, my life, my family, all of it was on fire now, and I didn't know how to put it out. But I knew one thing: I wouldn't break. I was Jack Harper, and I would get through this, even if it burned me to the ground. The silence in the house was as if the very air had died. I sat in my chair in the living room, gripping the arms of the chair so tightly that the wood creaked beneath my fingers. The lamplight cast long shadows on the walls, and each one felt like a shard of what I had lost. Upstairs, Sarah was still sobbing, her sobs echoing through the half-open bedroom door like a distant explosion. I didn't move. I couldn't. Everything inside me was burned out: anger, pain, betrayal, all twisted into a tight knot that I kept under control only by sheer force of will. I was a veteran. I knew how to survive, even when everything was falling apart. Footsteps on the stairs made me look up. Sarah was coming down, her face wet with tears, her eyes red, her hair disheveled. She still had the sheet wrapped around her, as if it could protect her from what I had seen, from what I knew. She stopped in the doorway of the living room, her hands shaking as she clutched them to her chest. "Jack," her voice was hoarse, broken. "Please, listen to me. I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake. I raised my hand, stopping her. My gaze was cold as the ice on the mountain peaks. "Don't," I said, my voice low but firm as a hammer blow. "I've seen it all. I know it all. Your words won't change anything." She sobbed, stepping closer, her eyes pleading, but I felt no pity. Not now. "Jack, I love you," she said, her voice shaking as if she were grasping at her last straw. "It was stupid. It didn't mean anything. Ryan, he's just... I don't know. I'm confused. But I don't want to lose you, us, Tommy." The mention of Tommy was like a knife to the heart, but I didn't flinch. I stood, towering over her, and she backed away, her eyes wide with fear. Not that I might hit her, I would never lay a hand on a woman, but what she saw in my face, the emptiness, the determination. "You've already lost us," I said, each word falling like a stone. "You jumped in our bed with him, Sarah. You lied to me for months, maybe longer. Do you think I can forget that? Do you think I can live with that?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks, but I didn't stop. "You betrayed me. You betrayed Tommy. You're not part of this family anymore." Her knees gave way, and she sank down onto the couch, her sobs growing louder, almost hysterical. "Please, Jack," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Give me a chance. I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. I'll never see him again. Just don't ruin our family." I looked at her, and for a moment I wanted to believe. I wanted to go back to the days when she was my anchor, when her laughter was my salvation, when I thought we were invincible. But then I remembered her text messages, her moans under him, her lies, and the urge died. "Pack your things," I said, my voice like steel. "You don't live here anymore." She froze, her eyes widening as if she couldn't believe I said that. "Jack," she began, but I interrupted. "I'm not kidding, Sarah. You have an hour. Take what you need and get out. Tommy stays with me." Her face contorted as if I had hit her. "Tommy," she whispered, "you can't take him away from me. He's my son." "He's our son," I corrected, stepping closer. "And I won't let him grow up with a mother who lies, who destroys everything he has. I'm filing for divorce, Sarah, and I'm fighting for full custody. You know I have proof. You know I'm going to win." She shook her head, her hands clutching the sheets as if it could hold her in place. "You can't do this," she said, her voice desperate. "You can't. Jack, please think of Tommy. He needs his mother. He needs stability," I said, not looking away. "He needs someone he can rely on, not you. Not now." She was sobbing, her shoulders shaking, but I didn't move. I couldn't afford to be weak. Not for her, not for me, but for Tommy. He was my son, my light, and I wouldn't let her betrayal ruin his life like it had ruined mine. I knew the court would side with me. I had the footage, the cameras, the drone, her texts. It was irrefutable. I could prove her infidelity, her lies, her irresponsibility, and I was ready to go all the way. "Where should I go?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have nothing." "It's not my problem," I said, though every word cut me like a knife. "You made a choice, Sarah. Now live with it." I turned and walked into the kitchen, not wanting to see her get ready. I could hear her footsteps upstairs. I could hear the cabinets opening, the hangers clanking. She was crying, her sobs echoing through the house, but I didn't go to her. I couldn't. Instead, I picked up the phone and started looking for a lawyer. I knew a guy in Denver, an ex-military guy who specialized in family law. He was tough as nails, and I knew he could help me get what I wanted. I wrote him a quick message, laying out the situation and asking for a meeting. Then I opened my laptop and started researching Colorado divorces, custody rights, and how to protect Tommy. I wasn't a lawyer, but I was a man who could plan, who could fight, and I was going to fight for my son. Sarah came down half an hour later, carrying a small bag over her shoulder. Her face was swollen from crying, but she made no further attempt to speak. She stood in the living room doorway, looking at me as if waiting for me to change my mind. I didn't. "I'll be back for the rest of my things," she said, her voice quiet, broken. "And I want to see Tommy." "The court will decide," I replied, without looking up from my laptop. "Go away." She stood there for a moment longer, as if hoping for something, but then she turned and walked out. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and the house fell silent. I sat there, listening to her footsteps fade down the street, to her car start, to her drive away, and only then did I allow myself to exhale. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel victory. All I felt was emptiness, like after a fire, when everything you knew turns to ashes. But I knew I had to move forward. For Tommy. He was at a friend's, and I decided not to pick him up today. He needed time to just be a kid, to not have to watch his world fall apart. I'd talk to him tomorrow, explain that his mom was going away for a while, that everything would be okay. I didn't know how to do it, didn't know how to explain to a 6-year-old that his mother was no longer a part of our lives, but I would find a way. I always did. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the empty street. The mountains loomed dark on the horizon, their silhouettes as unbending as my resolve. I would file for divorce. I would get full custody of Tommy. I would build a life for him where he would be safe, where he would know his father would never betray him. Sarah had made her choice, and now I was making mine. I returned to my laptop and continued working. Every action, every step was part of an operation, precise, like my days in the Corps. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing: I would not break. I was Jack Harper, and I would get through this, even if ashes were all that remained. The morning was chilly in the Boulder courtroom, despite the June sun streaming through the tall windows. I sat on a wooden bench, my suit the only one I owned, bought for my wedding, feeling tight, as if it were squeezing not just my body, but my insides. Tommy was with Frank, our neighbor, who had agreed to watch him while I was there. I didn't want my son to see this me, Sarah, the lawyers, tearing our lives apart under the sound of a judge's gavel. He was too young to understand, but I knew that someday I would have to explain it to him. For now, I just wanted to protect him. My lawyer, Mike Reed, sat next to me, shuffling papers. He was an ex-Marine like me, with a hard look in his eyes and a way of speaking that made it clear he knew his stuff. I'd hired him right after the night I kicked Sarah out. He'd reviewed the security footage, the text messages, everything I had, and he'd said my chances were good in Colorado. The state's divorce laws were no fault, which meant I couldn't directly use her infidelity as grounds for divorce. But child custody was another matter. Colorado courts put the child's best interests first when determining custody, and Mike was confident my evidence, her infidelity, her instability, her lies would give me the upper hand. Sarah sat across the room, her lawyer, a young woman with sharp eyes, whispering in her ear. Sarah looked pale, her hair pulled back into a tight bun, her eyes puffy as if she hadn't slept. She wasn't looking at me, and I was glad of it. I didn't want to see her eyes, didn't want to see tears or guilt or anything that might shake my resolve. I was here for Tommy and only for him. The judge, an older woman with a tired face, walked into the courtroom and everyone stood. She reviewed the paperwork, listened to our testimony. Mike was brief but precise, like a sniper. He presented the security footage, the correspondence, described how Sarah had behaved irresponsibly, how her actions had undermined our son's stability. He emphasized my role as a firefighter, a veteran, a father who had always been there, who had built a house with his own hands, who had never let us down. Sarah's lawyer tried to argue, talking about her role as a mother, about being a teacher, about her love for Tommy. But her defense was weak. The scandal at the school where she worked had already leaked into the local gossip columns. Some parents of a student had found out about her affair with Ryan, another teacher, and the rumors had spread like wildfire. She had been fired for breach of professional ethics, which only strengthened my case. When the judge spoke, her voice was even but firm. Under Colorado law, the court makes a decision based on the best interests of the child, she said, her eyes sliding over Sarah and me. Mr. Harper has demonstrated stability, responsibility, and the ability to provide a safe and stable environment for his son. Mrs. Harper, your actions, including proven infidelity and subsequent termination, raise doubts about your ability to be the primary caregiver. I heard Sarah sob, but I didn't look at her. The judge continued. The court awards primary physical and legal custody of Thomas Harper to his father, Jack Harper. Mrs. Harper is granted supervised visitation rights in consultation with Mr. Harper and on a schedule approved by the court. The hammer banged, and it was all over. Mike clapped me on the shoulder, his face stern, but with a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "You did it, Jack," he said quietly. "Tommy's with you." I nodded, but I felt no joy. The victory was empty, like a burned-out house. I had one custody, but I had lost my family. Sarah stood up, her lawyer supporting her by the elbow as she walked out of the courtroom. She didn't look at me, and I didn't call her. Everything between us had burned to the ground. Sarah left for Denver a week later. I heard from neighbors that she was living with her sister in a small apartment on the outskirts of town. The high school scandal had ruined her reputation in Pine Creek, and she couldn't stay. I didn't follow her, didn't ask, didn't call. She was part of my past, and I didn't want that past to affect Tommy. She called a couple of times, asking to see him, but I kept things under control, following the court order. Supervised visits, only in my presence. I didn't trust her, not anymore. Life went on in Pine Creek. I went back to work, putting out fires, checking equipment, joking with the guys in the unit. They respected me even more after the trial, not because they knew the details, but because they saw how I held up. The neighbors clapped me on the shoulder, called me a hero, not just for pulling people out of fires, but for the way I was handling the divorce. They didn't know that there was an emptiness inside me, like a black hole, devouring everything I had ever felt. Tommy was my anchor. Every morning I woke him up, made him breakfast oatmeal with honey, his favorite, and drove him to school. In the evenings, we played soccer in the yard, built Lego forts, watched old dinosaur movies. He asked about Sarah, and I answered evasively but honestly. Mom went to visit her aunt in Denver, I said, trying to keep my voice even. But you can always talk to her if you want. He nodded, but his eyes were more serious than a 6-year-old should be. I taught him to be strong, just like the Corps taught me. Sometimes life hits you, Tommy, I told him one day as we sat on the porch looking at the stars. But you have to get up, always, because you're stronger than you think. He looked at me, his little face so open, so trusting, and I felt something tighten in my chest. I couldn't let myself fall apart. Not for him. But at night, when Tommy was asleep, I sat in the living room, in the same chair where it all started. I didn't drink, I didn't scream, I didn't break anything. I just sat there, staring into the darkness, and I felt the emptiness filling me. My eyes were heavier. I saw it in the mirror, in the eyes of the guys at work, in the way Frank looked at me when he brought me a beer. They saw a hero, but I was just a man trying not to drown. I didn't talk about Sarah. I didn't talk about the pain, the betrayal, the way her betrayal had burned away everything I loved. I stayed silent because words were useless. They couldn't bring back what I'd lost. But I kept moving forward for Tommy, for myself, to prove that I could still be a father even if there was nothing left inside me. Every day I got up, made breakfast, took Tommy to school, put out fires, made plans. I was Jack Harper, and I didn't give up. But now, when I looked at the mountains, they didn't seem so unyielding. They were just rock, and I was a man who had to find a way to go on, even if everything I had turned to ash. Darkness had fallen over Pine Creek like a heavy blanket, but I didn't feel the cold despite the bitter wind blowing off the mountains. I sat in my truck, parked on an empty street a few miles from home, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. There was a USB drive on the passenger seat, small and black and unassuming, but inside it was a bomb that could ruin another life. Security footage, drone footage, everything I'd collected that night I'd caught Sarah with Ryan. I copied it all, not because I wanted revenge, but because the truth needed to come out. Not just for me, but for someone who, like me, had been betrayed. I learned about Ryan's wife from one of the guys at the firehouse. Pine Creek is a small town where rumors spread faster than wildfire. Her name was Emily, and she worked as a nurse at the local clinic, a soft-spoken woman with tired eyes who people always said was too good for someone like Ryan. I found her address through the school directory Sarah had left in the kitchen one day. The house was in the next neighborhood, neat, with a white picket fence and flower beds that someone clearly loved. I parked across the street, looking out at the warm light that spilled through the windows. My pulse was steady, like it had been in the days before I'd prepared for a mission, but something was boiling inside, not anger, but something colder, sharper, justice. I wasn't sure what I was doing was right. In the Corps, we were taught that the truth could be a weapon, but it could also be a burden. I didn't want to ruin Emily's life, but she deserved to know who was sleeping next to her. She deserved a choice, one I hadn't had until I saw Sarah's messages. I grabbed the USB drive, shoved it into my jacket pocket, and stepped out of the car. Gravel crunched under my boots, each step hitting my chest like a hammer. I knocked on the door, not giving myself time to change my mind. The door opened almost immediately. Emily stood before me, her blonde hair pulled back into a loose ponytail and wearing green scrubs, as if she had just returned from a shift. Her eyes, blue and tired, glanced at me with mild surprise, but no fear. "Yes," she asked, her voice soft but wary. "How can I help you?" I clenched my jaw, feeling the words stick in my throat. I wasn't a person who liked to talk, but it had to be done. "My name is Jack Harper," I said, my voice low but firm. I'm, I'm Sarah's husband, ex-husband." Her face didn't change, but I noticed her fingers tighten slightly on the door frame. "I know who you are," she said quietly. "Rumors. They travel fast." I nodded, not surprised. Pine Creek was such a place. "I have something for you," I said, pulling a USB drive out of my pocket and handing it to her. "These are notes about your husband and about Sarah." She looked at the drive, her brows furrowing slightly, but she didn't take it right away. "What's on it?" she asked, her voice even, almost emotionless. I took a breath, trying to keep myself under control. "Evidence. Video of them together in my house. I thought you should know." Her eyes met mine, and I saw something there, not shock, not pain, but something deeper, like she already suspected. She reached out slowly and took the drive, her fingers cold when they touched mine. "Thank you," she said, her voice as calm as a mountain lake. "I'll take a look." I expected tears, questions, maybe anger, but there was none. She just stood there, holding the drive, her face as impenetrable as a mask. I felt a pang of respect. She didn't break down, didn't scream, didn't make a scene. She was stronger than I expected. "If you need anything," I began, but she shook her head. "I can handle it," she said, her lips twitching slightly, almost in a smile, but without warmth. "Thank you, Jack." She closed the door, and I stood there on the porch, feeling the wind whip at my face. I didn't know what she would do with the drive, but I knew one thing. She wasn't the type to stay with someone who had betrayed her. I walked back to the truck, got behind the wheel, and sat there for a few minutes, looking at her house. The lights in the living room went out, and I realized she was probably already watching the tapes. I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just an emptiness that grew with each passing day. A few days later, I heard from Frank that Emily had left Ryan. She packed up, took their dog, and went to live with her parents in Colorado Springs. No tears, no drama, she simply vanished from his life, like a shadow disappearing into the night. Ryan had reportedly tried to get her back, but she wouldn't answer his calls. I wasn't surprised. She was a woman who knew her worth, and she wasn't going to live with a lie. I didn't look for her, I didn't call, I didn't ask. I did what I thought was right, and now it was her burden, her choice. My war wasn't with her, and it wasn't with Ryan. My war was inside, with the emptiness Sarah left behind, the pain I couldn't let go. I'd go home to Tommy, cook him dinner, help him with his homework, and teach him how to kick a goal. He was my light, my reason, and I wouldn't let myself fall apart, even when the emptiness became unbearable at night in the silence. At work, I was respected even more. The guys in the unit called me Sarge, joked that I could put out a fire with just my gaze. Neighbors brought me pies, clapped me on the shoulder, told me what a great guy I was, and hung in there for my son. But I didn't tell them the truth. I didn't tell them how much it hurt every day, how I saw Sarah in every corner of the house, how her betrayal still stung like a burn. My eyes were harder, I knew it. I saw it in the mirror, in Tommy's eyes when he looked at me, thinking I was invincible. I wasn't invincible. I was just a dad who did everything he could to make sure his son didn't have to see the ashes that were left of our family. And I kept moving forward, one step at a time, because I had no other choice. I was Jack Harper, and I didn't give up, even when everything I had went up in smoke. Fall came to Pine Creek with the smell of fallen leaves and a sharp wind that drove the clouds over the mountains like a herd. I stood in the yard of our new house, unfinished but taking shape. The foundation beams were in place, the walls were starting to rise, and I came here every night after work to hammer nails, sand boards, and make things with my hands. This wasn't just a house, it was an attempt to build something new, something that wasn't tainted by the memory of Sarah, the lies she'd told us, what she'd done to our family. Tommy ran alongside me, carrying little pieces of wood he called his tools, and his laughter was the only thing keeping me going. It had been 2 months since the court had awarded me full custody. 2 months of learning how to be a single father, learning how to cook breakfast, how to braid my hair for school events, learning how to answer Tommy's questions about where Mom was and why she wasn't with us. I told the truth, but only the part of it he could understand. Mom lives in Denver, but you can see her, I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. He nodded, his eyes as clear as a mountain lake, but I saw a shadow in them. He knew something was wrong, even if he couldn't name it. Sarah called a few times, her voice quiet, almost broken. She asked to see Tommy, and each time I felt something inside me tighten, like an old burn was making itself felt. I didn't want to see her, didn't want to hear her voice, but I knew I couldn't take Tommy's mother away. Not entirely. The court had granted her supervised visits, and I had decided that it would be on my terms. Only in my presence, only in public places where I could be in control. I didn't trust her, and for good reason, damn it. The first meeting took place in the park on a Saturday, when the leaves were turning yellow and the air smelled of smoke from distant campfires. I brought Tommy, his backpack slung over one shoulder, a football clutched in his hands. Sarah was waiting by a wooden bench, her coat buttoned to her chin, her face looking tired, almost haggard. She smiled when she saw Tommy, and he ran toward her, throwing the ball onto the grass. "Mom!" he cried, and his voice was so happy I felt a stab of pain. He hugged her, and she held him close, her eyes closed as if she were trying to hold on to this moment forever. I stood to the side, my arms crossed over my chest, my gaze as cold as the mountain wind. She looked at me, her eyes full of guilt, but I didn't respond. I simply nodded, indicating that she could begin. They sat on the bench, chatting, playing with the ball, and Tommy laughed as if nothing had changed. But I saw him glance back at me occasionally, his eyes searching for confirmation that everything was okay. I smiled at him, but there was an emptiness inside me that wouldn't go away. Sarah tried to talk to me when Tommy walked away to the swing. "Jack," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "Thank you for letting me. I know I don't deserve this." "It's not for you," I replied without looking at her. "It's for Tommy." She nodded, her lips pressed together, but she didn't cry. She'd learned to control herself, or maybe she was just tired of crying. I didn't ask her how she was doing in Denver, didn't ask about her sister, her job, anything. It wasn't my business anymore. She was the mother of my son, but she wasn't my wife. She wasn't in my family. "I want to be a part of his life," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Please, Jack, I'll do whatever you say." "You'll see him on weekends," I said, my voice as hard as concrete. "In my presence. If you try anything, I'll go back to court. You know I have what it takes to win again." She lowered her head, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her coat. "I understand," she whispered. Tommy came back, his cheeks pink from running, and I walked him to the car. He babbled on about how his mother had promised to take him to the zoo, and I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. I could see how happy he was with her, but I could also see the way he looked at me with a new seriousness, like he sensed that I had changed. And I knew he was right. I was different. Harder, sterner, stronger. Not because I wanted to, but because there was no other way. The days passed like a river, slow but relentless. I worked at the fire department, putting out fires, checking equipment, joking with the guys, but it was all mechanical, like I was on a mission. My real work was at home, or more accurately, building a new house. I'd bought a lot on the edge of Pine Creek, away from the old house where every corner reminded me of Sarah. The new house was my project, my way of moving forward. I poured the foundation, built the walls, laid the shingles, and every nail I hammered was a way to mend the cracks in my soul. Tommy helped as much as he could. He carried boards, held a hammer, asked questions about what our new house would look like. "Dad, will I get my own room?" he asked one day, sitting on a pile of sawdust, his face covered in dust. "Of course, champion," I replied, wiping the sweat from my forehead. "The biggest one, with a window overlooking the mountains." He smiled, and I felt something warm stir in my chest, but it quickly faded. I was a father, I was strong, but inside me there was still emptiness, like a burnt-out forest. I didn't talk about it, didn't show it. The neighbors kept calling me a hero. The guys in the unit clapped me on the shoulder, but I kept quiet. My gaze became heavier, I knew it, but I couldn't change it. It was my armor, my protection from the world that was trying to break me. Sarah came over on weekends, as I allowed. We met in the park, sometimes in a cafe, always with me present. She played with Tommy, read to him, told him stories, and he was happy, his eyes shining like stars. But I saw the way she looked at me, with guilt, with hope, with something I didn't want to examine. I didn't give her a chance to talk about us, about the past. It was dead, and I wasn't going to pick through the ashes. One day she tried to speak when Tommy ran out for ice cream. "Jack," she said, her voice quiet, almost pleading, "I know you hate me, but I want to be a good mother to him." "Then be it," I replied, my voice cold as stone. "But don't expect me to forget what you did." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears, but she didn't cry. I didn't feel pity. I only felt tired, as if every conversation with her took a part of me that I couldn't get back. I kept building the house, kept working, kept being a father. Tommy grew, his questions became more complex, but I answered them as best I could. I taught him to be strong, to be honest, to be better than me. And every night, when he fell asleep, I sat on the porch of the unfinished house, looking at the mountains that had stood here long before me and would stand here after me. They were silent witnesses to my pain, my strength, my struggle. I was Jack Harper, and I wasn't giving up. But now I knew that strength wasn't just about taking a punch. It was about keeping going, even when there was nothing left inside but emptiness. And for Tommy, I was building not just a home, but a new life for both of us. Winter came quietly to Pine Creek, blanketing the town in snow that crunched under boots and glittered like diamonds in the moonlight. The new house was almost done, the walls up, the roof covered in dark shingles, the windows in place, the smell of new wood still in the air. I worked on it every night after my shift at the firehouse, hammering nails, sanding floors, painting walls. It wasn't just a house, it was my way of standing up, of proving to myself and Tommy that we could build something of our own, something untainted by the past. Tommy helped, carrying tools, asking questions, and his presence was the only thing keeping the emptiness inside me from consuming everything. One evening, as the snow fell softly outside and Tommy and I sat eating dinner in the old house, he suddenly put down his fork and looked at me. His eyes, as blue as Sarah's, were serious, too serious for a 7-year-old boy. "Dad," he said quietly, "why isn't Mom with us?" The question hit like a bullet, but I was ready. I knew he would ask, knew this moment would come. I put my plate down, wiped my hands on a napkin, and looked at him, trying to keep my voice firm but gentle. "Tommy," I began, choosing my words carefully, as if I were navigating a minefield. "Mom made a choice that was bad for our family. She was with someone else, and I couldn't trust her anymore. So she's living on her own in Denver. But she's still your mom, and she loves you. You can see her whenever you want, and I'll always be here to make sure it's safe." He frowned, his fingers fiddling with the edge of the tablecloth. "But why did she do that?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Didn't she love us?" I felt my throat tighten, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. "She loved us, champion," I said, and it was true, as far as I could tell. But sometimes people make mistakes, big mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes mean things change. I didn't want you to grow up in a home where there was no trust. You deserve better." He nodded, his eyes dropping to the table, but I could see him considering my words. "You're not going to leave, are you, Dad?" he asked, looking up. I reached across the table and took his small hand in mine. "Never," I said, my voice hard as granite. "I'll always be here, Tommy, always." He smiled, a weak but sincere smile, and I felt something warm stir in my chest, breaking through the emptiness that had lived there for months. Sarah continued to come on weekends. We would meet in the park or at a cafe, always in my presence. She would play with Tommy, bring him books, toys, and try to be the mother he deserved. I could see her trying, her eyes shining when he laughed, but I could also see her guilt, her pain that wouldn't go away. She tried to talk to me, not about the past, but about small things, about Tommy, about school, about the weather, but I kept my distance. My voice was cold, my answers short. I wasn't being cruel, I just couldn't give her more than she deserved. One day, after another meeting, when Tommy ran to the car, she lingered by the bench, her coat buttoned up to her chin, her hands nervously fiddling with the strap of her bag. "Jack," she said quietly, her voice shaking, "I know you'll never forgive me, but I want you to know, I'm so sorry. I ruined everything, and I can't fix it, but I'm sorry." I looked at her, her face pale, her eyes shining with the tears she was holding back. Part of me wanted to say something, maybe even comfort her, but that part was buried under the ashes of what she had done. "Regret doesn't change the past, Sarah," I said, my voice as level as a blade. "Focus on Tommy. That's all that matters." She nodded, her lips pressed together, and I turned to leave. I couldn't forgive. Not because I was cruel, but because forgiving would mean forgetting, and I couldn't forget. Not her moans in our bed, not her lies, not the way she stole my faith in what I thought was my home. I could let her be a mother to Tommy, but that was all. Another month passed, and the house was finished. I stood in his living room, smelling of fresh paint and wood, looking at the walls I'd built with my own hands. It wasn't just a house, it was a new life, a clean slate for Tommy and me. We'd moved in at the beginning of December, and Tommy had been running through the rooms, picking out where his bed would go, where he'd hang his dinosaur posters. His laughter echoed in the empty rooms, and I felt the corners of my lips twitch into a smile. Not because of anyone, but because I did it. I built it. I held on. The fire department continued to be my salvation. The guys respected me, called me Sarge, and joked that I could put out a fire with just my gaze. Neighbors brought food, helped me move, told me how great I was for coping. But I didn't tell them about the emptiness, about sitting in the dark at night, looking at the mountains, the pain still smoldering inside. My gaze was heavier, I knew it, but I didn't try to hide it. It was my truth, my armor. Tommy noticed that I had changed. He didn't say it outright, but I saw the way he looked at me when I was teaching him how to tie his shoelaces or make sandwiches. "Dad, you're like a superhero now," he said one day when we were painting his room blue. "Like you're not afraid of anything." I laughed, but the laugh was dry. "I'm just your dad, the champion," I said, ruffling his hair, "and I'll always be here for you." The night before Christmas was cold but clear, the stars burning like lanterns over the mountains. Tommy and I had a fire going in the yard of our new house, in a hole I had dug myself. He held a stick with marshmallows on it, his face alight with fire and delight as he watched the sweets roast and brown. "Dad, look, mine's ready," he exclaimed, showing me a perfectly toasted marshmallow. "Good job," I said, smiling. And it was a real smile, not for anyone else, but for him, for us, for this moment. I picked up my stick, toasted my marshmallow, and ate it, feeling the sweetness melt in my mouth. Tommy laughed when I accidentally got gooey, and I laughed with him, feeling the emptiness inside me recede for the first time in a long time, if only for a little while. We sat by the fire, watching the flames dance in the night, and I thought about how far we'd come. About Sarah, about the pain, about the betrayal, about the home I'd built from nothing. I wasn't whole, I wasn't the Jack I'd once been, but I was here with my son, and that was enough. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow on our faces, and I realized that some fires do not burn out, they cleanse. You definitely don't want to miss the next story. It's going to blow you away. Hit the subscribe button. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.